Everything that you're currently seeing, all of the choices of the words that I'm currently saying, and even the sound of my voice were all generated by AI. Well, if you believe that for even a second, the hype with AI is absolutely real right now, and with good reason. What we're seeing out of video is insane when it comes to blurring the line between what is real and what is not, which is kind of scary in a lot of ways, but we'll dive into this. And also, a lot of people are really afraid about what AI is going to mean for their jobs. It feels like every tech company right now is suddenly an AI company, where everything must be AI-ified to make things better and more useful, even though that's not usually the case in my experience, at least not yet. But things are moving fast, and I think it's going to have a really big impact. And one group of people that are especially concerned right now are creatives, with good reason too. We have things like Stable Diffusion, we have DALL-E, and other AI generation services, which can honestly generate really incredible things almost instantly. And I'm going to dive into that with a whole bunch of different examples about how I feel about it, what I think the drawbacks are, which I'll say there's some really significant drawbacks, and why ultimately I think creatives will always have a really strong place in creative industries. But of course, things always change, and I assume they will continue to change moving forward. So first up, I'm going to use a really simple example in Photoshop. And what's a better way to dive into Photoshop than with a bad selfie of myself? And one simple example here is something like removing yourself from the background. Historically, this has been an absolute pain in the butt for me to do, especially when the background is complex or there's a bunch of hair, whether you're trying to move a dog out or just cut yourself out of an image. But now in Photoshop, there's a button that says remove background. You click that. This thing will do that super fast and honestly better than I probably would have anyways. So when it comes to saving time in a simple way, I think this is a really good example. But let's give a bit more of an extreme example that I think people would think are a much better or much more fair example of what AI is. So I have two images of myself here. They're the exact same just to show the differences, and I'm almost certainly going to regret doing this in a video. But let's see what happens here. So you can crop in Photoshop, and I'm going to crop myself really quick because now there's a generative fill. So I can go ahead and open that crop back up and then extend this back down, and there'll be a button that says Generative Expand. I click that, and then I click Generate here, and it's essentially going to try to fill in this bottom portion of the image. And honestly, it does a pretty good job most of the time. And this isn't the part that I'm going to regret sharing. But once this does its thing, I assume it will do a good job of putting a shirt back on, which it absolutely did. So if we compare this one to the new one, I would have a hard time telling that this isn't real. It added a pocket, which I guess is interesting, but there's also a few different examples that you can pick from really quickly and easily. So this is honestly pretty incredible tech, in my opinion. But if I want to horrify myself, I can also crop all the way up here to about my nose. So now it's just my eyes, and I can once again do a generative expand to see what happens when it tries to redraw my face. And I will say, I have yet to see a good result. But let's do this. Let's click that button and then go ahead and hit generate. And now it's gonna do something that I will regret sharing. And as it processes here, let's just see how this compares to myself and my future self generated by, oh good, you know AI? You tried. But I think it's fascinating. Like the teeth are always terrible in this AI. It always gives me a bunch of facial hair in every example I've ever done, which I just don't understand. But this is creepy. Like this is definitely like a weird zone where you compare this to my actual self. And I'm still, maybe AI believes I simply need like full facial hair. Like that is my future self and AI knows it better than in any case. This is kind of rough where we are right now, and I think that Photoshop's built-in AI is, in my opinion, pretty far behind. Like you can see the cat tower here, it's just floating in space, which is an absolute constant attribute of AI-generated art. But as perhaps a more practical example here, here's an image I took in Minneapolis a long time ago. I can also just essentially extend this scene. It's really easy to do. You just generate, you click that button, and it'll go ahead and try to fill this in. It's not perfect. In fact, it is very far from perfect most of the time, But I do think these sorts of things will improve, and it's a really cool way to adjust photos. Like, this is exactly what happened the first time I tried this. It turns Minneapolis into this weird future ocean coastal city. But there's different examples here that you can go ahead and pick. The crazy looking just hodgepodge of elements is very typical AI. It doesn't make sense when you look at it, but still, I think it's cool. I think it's pushing things forward in a unique way. And I'm thinking in the next few years, these sorts of use cases will rapidly get better. But now we have a more practical example for what I think people are going to be worried about when it comes to being a creative and ultimately having AI potentially take your job. So for reference, I was a designer for a very long time, over a decade, and I was never a really strong illustrator. That wasn't my particular point of focus, but I do think being a designer, having the ability to illustrate is a huge perk. And of course, if you are an illustrator, this sort of stuff is your bread and butter. So I threw this into DALL-E, which is OpenAI's image generating tool, and I said, draw a frog wearing a pirate hat, driving a race car. And honestly, what this thing made in a few seconds is infinitely better than basically anything I could have illustrated in this sort of a style. There's certainly still issues where if we look at this flag, there's kind of a weird thing going on there. Like these sorts of glitches, there's something weird going on here, are really just constant in AI images. And I think that is something that is going to have to improve. And I think at least short term, when you are creative, you can clean this stuff up manually if you have that capability. So I think even if people are using AI images, if they want things to look their best, you're going to want to go back in and clean stuff up. So this is a simple example, but I think this is an example where if you are drawing really quick sort of flash art like this, and that is your bread and butter of what your job is, it's going to be tough. And I'll talk about the business Fiverr, which I've derided in the past for what it's done to the creative industry, but I think that'll be a fascinating example, but we'll cover that moving forward. But here is, I think, a really interesting example because this was actually posted in the New York Times. And for reference, New York Times has historically been the top of the top for editorial illustrators. So if you got your work into the New York Times, it was a badge of honor. It was a really big deal. And I saw this and I immediately knew it was AI. And what I find kind of interesting here is it says, the title, How Has Daniel Kahneman Made Your Life Better? He's a fantastic individual, but it's Tim Maurer plus AI. So it specifically calls out that this is AI, and it then validated, like, yes, I was correct. This is certainly AI. And there's just things that you can very easily spot. The glass is here. It's like, what is going on with this weird thing? Like these sorts of just issues, very common with AI. Both of this dude's eyes are extremely creepy, for lack of a better word. This dude's glasses, there's something wrong there. You can just tell it doesn't look right. So I was honestly disappointed to see this. Like, I don't know how or what the artist did to manipulate this to make it unique from whatever AI generated, but they failed to do what I think you should do, like this guy's eye is messed up, which is clean up those issues. I think if you're using AI as a tool to help you do new things, do things more swiftly, generate elements, you would hopefully see that this guy's hand, it's like an art student in third grade who doesn't know how to draw a hand. So it's like, well, you get 3 fingers and there's kind of an extra one sort of just stuck in there. It's like, okay, but this is in the New York Times. I have higher expectations. I think you should go in and fix that stuff. So here's one example of something being used in mass publication, and I think falling a bit short. And it would make a lot of sense to me to use this sort of stuff if the article was about AI or if the article was about AI art. But it's about a psychologist who essentially changed the history of economics, which kudos to Daniel Kahneman for doing so, but I just don't see why AI art was the appropriate thing to do here. So here's another really quick example. As I was, I think, going through like my weekly discover on Spotify, I saw this album art, immediately screenshotted it because it just screamed AI art to me. And it's really easy to see why you form that opinion. Like you look at it, there's just a certain style with current AI art, but it's like, what's going on here? Why are there like weird floating pipes and just metal? It just doesn't make sense. So I think that's a really big weakness when you're using AI, is that if you're trying to form a coherent narrative and you're not willing to go in and fix the really crazy stuff, it just does things like, honestly, it looks like a sci-fi cover in a future where all spaceships are made out of pipe-looking materials and are just like floating around in space, as for unknown reasons, this thing is real flooded. And I absolutely get it. If you don't want to pay an artist or a designer or an illustrator to do, one cover for a single you're releasing, maybe you don't want to spend that money, or you just want something now really fast. Like, it's honestly very hard to beat AI at that purpose. And I think moving forward, AI will be the absolute best way to cheaply make stuff that looks pretty darn good, but is ultimately flawed, at least currently. So that's another example. But now let's get into one of the big weaknesses, which I find to be quite fascinating. Essentially, when I was making or considering making this video, I was trying to get a big fuzzy animal to put on my thumbnail cover on YouTube. So I said, hey, make this be inspired by things like Pokemon or the porgs from Star Wars, because I wanted that kind of a lovable, fuzzable, whatever you want to say, creature next to me. And no matter what I did, it would just refuse to use those as inspiration. And note that I didn't say, draw a Pokemon or draw a porg. I said, hey, be inspired by this. And I was using OpenAI's DALL-E to do this, and it would repeatedly refuse. So let me give you some examples of where AI suddenly decides it's totally fine to just use trademarked or copyrighted material. So here's one of the examples of this kind of creepy art that was made for me when I eventually did get it to start generating thumbnails for my YouTube video. In this case, it's like, you know what is fine? This janky wannabe YouTube logo. And it actually says YouTube under it, which I'll say I'm impressed. It actually spelled YouTube correctly. A lot of times text in AI is just a jumble of words that doesn't make a lot of sense. So that is improving. But why is this okay? Why can't you draw me something inspired by a porg? Is the porg a step too far? And here's another example. And you'll get to see how weird my mind works sometimes. So my boss at work got a new cat. The cat's name was Bloop. And I just put together Bloop and Fruit Loops and came up with Bloop Loops, which I'm not trying to defend my choices here, but I thought it'd be fun to have it draw up a cover of her cat on a Bloop Loops box and then send it to her. But look at this. This is obviously meant to be the General Mills logo, and it's just slapped on there. And while I'll say like this looks very much like Tony the Tiger as a cat that isn't a tiger because the color has changed, but this art is fantastic. Like, it would take me, I think I could make something like this, even though I'm not really a designer anymore. I could make something like this if I spent enough time, but this did it instantly. And that's really incredibly impressive. But why rip off the General Mills logo? And then I did a second and it ripped off the Kellogg's logo. So the differentiation still around how it's using material and how it's using potentially copyrighted or potentially trademarked material, I think is a massive issue, especially if you want to use AI art in a way that reflects on you or your business, or even if you want to do stuff like trademark it. So while I think all of this stuff is incredible, and I want to make it very clear, we're still early on in this journey when it comes to AI images. So I assume the problems that I have with this right now will be rapidly fixed, rapidly improved. So if you watch this video 5 years from now, I am certain whatever AI is in the world will be far more advanced than where it is today. There's simply too much money, too much time, too much effort being poured into it for rapid advancement not to happen. And of course, these are just visual images. There's also video. And I think video is sort of the ultimate creepy when it comes to what AI is currently doing and how that's going to influence the world. Because once we can't really, at least easily, visibly tell the difference between what is real video and what is not real video. Think of the intro of this video where I said, hey, this is all generated by AI. If you actually can't make that differentiation, I think the world fundamentally changes in a few ways. So there's currently a couple really big players that are currently working on AI video and really shifting that landscape quickly. One of them is Runway. And honestly, I am blown away by how the videos look from Runway and what they can do based on what are ultimately simple prompts. But I think when you really dig in and look at these videos closely, there's still this unrealistic, just creepy or kind of otherworldly factor to the way certain things look, the way certain transitions happen, the movement, especially with people. If you look closely, you can tell that this isn't actually a real person, but if the video wasn't displayed large or displayed high quality, I think it would be extraordinarily difficult to tell this. And this is still early on. So what does this mean 5 years from now? And the same thing with OpenAI's Sora. So there's multiple companies that are producing these ultra realistic, ultra high-end videos, and it can be very realistic. It can also have a style or a look like a cartoon or an anime or a Pixar film. So I'm thinking if you work in something like video FX or you're doing 3D modeling, it'd be really reasonable to be concerned about what does this mean moving forward? Like, how is this going to change my job and what I do and how I ultimately make money? Like, this is what I do for a living, and this can generate these sorts of scenes that could take me weeks or months in a matter of minutes. And I think what it boils down to for me is the aspect of control. At least currently when it comes to control, you give up a ton of control when you use AI. You can prompt it to do things, and there's like different levels there that I'll dig into a bit. You can even build your own generative models. You can completely train the model on your own to have a ton of control over the visual input that it uses to build what you're seeing. But if I was drawing something in 3D in a scene and someone said, hey, move this thing 3 pixels to the left, that's really easy for me to do as the person making that content. But if you tell AI to do that, it's sort of a dice roll as to what the output is that you're going to get and how exactly it's going to pull all this stuff off. At least with my knowledge, with what I've done thus far, I think professionals will certainly have more control. They'll understand how to do this, and this will also improve rapidly over time. But even trying to do that thumbnail, when I showed that kind of terrible example with the bad YouTube logo, I have no idea why it showed that. I didn't ask for anything like that. I specifically said make it super fuzzy and lovable. And it gave me a creepy alien with a botched YouTube logo. And no matter what I did moving forward, everything it generated after that continued to look kind of corrupted, for lack of a better word, and I had to just reset the prompt to stop it from doing crazy things. So these sorts of things are super frustrating for me. I don't know how much longer I will continue to spend generating fuzzy creatures to get one I'm happy with on my YouTube thumbnail. I assume in total at least an hour to try to get something I like, where if I was working with a professional, they could understand what I wanted and make those changes and I'd be satisfied almost instantly. But of course, it takes them longer. So there's your trade-off. And I want to talk quickly about the website Fiverr, which I've spoken down about previously because Fiverr has a lot of issues. And I think a lot of those issues happen when you simply try to pay people as little as you possibly can to do some work. That isn't to say the work on Fiverr is all bad. That'd be absolutely false. There's incredible people from a wide variety of industries, including they'll get fair pay in some instances. But there's also sort of the bottom of the barrel stuff where someone will design you a logo for $10 or $25. They'll do a complex illustration for what seems like a really low fee. And part of that is there's people from all over the world. So $10 in the US is not the same as $10 everywhere in the world. So it can mean different things, and that's part of a global economy. But a concern of mine has always been when I go through and I look at logos on Fiverr, I can tell that some of these are using completely stock assets. So they are just buying packs or downloading packs of pre-made elements, and then they're rearranging them to sell this logo to someone for $25. And the problem there is you can't trademark that logo if you don't actually have the right to use all the elements. So if the creator ultimately stole those elements or just bought a pack that doesn't transfer the actual intellectual property along with it so you can trademark it, that's a massive problem. And maybe you go through the cost of trying to trademark a logo. Maybe you even do so, and ultimately you get sued or someone comes after you because they spot it in the wild and realize you are using their assets and you don't have permission to use them that way. And when I was initially writing the outline of what I wanted to say in this video, I was going to say, if people on Fiverr are already not constantly using AI to quickly generate things and resell them, they will. That will absolutely happen until, and this blew my mind, Fiverr actually has a section to just resell AI art. Where I was like, whoa, why? And there's reason for this, I think. Like if you're not comfortable or if you don't know how to generate your own AI art, I think it makes sense that you would want to pay someone, $25, $50, $100 to do it for you. Although I think my general point of view is it's worth learning how to do this stuff. It's actually not as complex as you might think. So take the time, figure it out. And if you take your time and you ultimately can't get the output that you like, then I think it makes absolute sense to maybe pay someone to go in there and do this. Although it's still a bit weird that in many cases, the costs of getting someone to generate AI art for you is on par with a custom illustration or a custom design. And like I said, the illustrations and designs have that issue when it comes to, is this actually original art? Are you making this from scratch, or are you just reselling things you've downloaded or packs you've purchased online? But this is kind of its own new form of reselling, so to speak. But let's say you go in and purchase some AI generated art, and the person you're buying it from takes a lot of time to customize it to make it look exactly the way you wanted it to. They clean stuff up. They fix all the issues that I called out in the images we checked out. I think that's an awesome service, and those sorts of services should exist. And I think it's this interesting middle ground that will exist between AI art and artists who are still looking to make money. And this is a great way for them to do so. They use their AI skills to generate the images quickly, then they clean them up, they polish them and make them look super professional. But it's time to figure it out. Is AI the end? The end of creativity? And ultimately, I think true creatives will always have a place in this world. There's a lot of advantages, especially right now, where if you want complete control over how something's going to look, whether it's a picture, whether it's video, whether it's audio, an individual craftsperson can give you a level of control that at least I, with my knowledge of AI, can't even get close. AI generated stuff remains super frustrating for me, and I always have to regenerate stuff over and over and over until I get something pretty close to what I'm looking for. So I think a human has immense value there and can give you exactly what you want, assuming their talents line up, which is a big assumption because everyone has their own style. And I think that is a huge thing to consider here if you are a creative, is that you need to develop a point of view. You need to develop a style that's all your own and be able to execute against that at a really high level. Because if you can do that, it's like, hey, if I want a Quentin Tarantino film, you know who I'm calling? It's Quentin Tarantino. And he won't answer, because who am I? But people will continue to watch his films because of who he is, his point of view, the way he makes things. And do I think you could train AI using only Tarantino films to make something very Tarantino-like? I absolutely do. And I think that will continually get better. But I also think artists evolve over time and change, and their point of view changes, and they have something unique to bring. Where when you train an AI model, ultimately it's just using that historical information to do its best approximation of what it thinks a Tarantino film is. Where, Quentin knows. Like, he knows his craft. If I want a Scorsese film, I call Martin. Like, hey, Martin, do another Goodfellas. Goodfellas 2. Thank you. And he's the person who's going to execute against that the best, based on the sum total of all of his knowledge thus far, and then also where he projects things going in the future. And as we talked about, I think the legal considerations also, when it comes to paying someone to do it directly versus using AI, are going to be massive. And I expect lawsuits to be constant because AI doesn't exist in a bubble. It is trained, quite literally, on human creativity. And to be clear, artists are also trained on human creativity. It doesn't exist in a bubble for them either. But if you want to actually own your artwork, be able to trademark it, and know that you can use it legally without question, by far, getting a trusted human to do this work is going to be better than AI. Because I think we will see many, many more lawsuits over the data that AI uses to train its artwork. And those companies that produce these models will have to figure out how to handle that. Like, how do you value, if you train your model on the sum total history of all of New York Times articles, how much is that worth? Like, what should you pay New York Times? I think most people would agree they should get paid something, but these will be massive legal battles. So I think at least in the short term, until this sort of stuff is really ironed out and we understand what is and isn't okay, it makes so much sense just to pay an individual, especially if you're doing something like a logo. There's no world in which I think AI is the appropriate way to do that. And also, when you pay someone for something like a logo, you have to realize the person making the logo isn't just doing exactly what you tell them, at least if they're good at what they do. They're trying to consider what your goals are, what you're trying to achieve, And they're using all their knowledge through all their time doing this craft to make the best product for you. And sometimes that means they show you something different than what you think you're going to get, but it ultimately ends up being a better product. Where when you're using AI prompts, you're really just telling it, do this thing, and it's going to approximate its best guess at what that thing is for you, which might be great. It could be perfect. But ultimately, you are stuck in your own frame of mind. So I think it's very valuable to have that other point of view to help give you a perspective on perhaps what you should be doing versus what you think you should be doing. So last up here, I want to give some tangible examples of why I think human creativity will continue to be really special, even if AI becomes relatively perfect and can do all this stuff just 10 out of 10 amazing. 1, here's a pot I made. Check out my pot. Do you like nice pots? So this is probably, to a professional pot maker, not very good, but I was proud of it. It's like I painted this thing. It looks pretty nice. You can put things in it, like a USB cable. You could fill it full of water and pour it on someone. Anyways, the opportunities are endless with a matte-made pot. But the thing is, if I were to give this to someone, I at least assume they'd appreciate that much more than if I bought a pot from Target, which would be more consistently produced. It'd have better glaze on it. It'd probably be stronger and better at most pot things than my pot is, because it's mass produced. It's meant to be very perfect, but you lose that human touch, that human element, which I think just makes things special. Even the dishes I use to eat food, I bought some that are made by actual people, and I prefer them to the mass produced ones, even though the mass produced ones are more consistent. They're way cheaper. There's just something nice about knowing that an actual person who spent their life trying to be really good at something, in that case, making pots, is now in your hand and you're using it. So I think those examples exist, and it's going to be different for everyone. Some people don't care at all about that. So they would want the mass-produced thing because it's cheaper. It's probably, but not certainly, of higher quality. It'll have less, human defects from the act of hand making it. But I think that's a consideration worth making. I think there is something special about knowing a real person made what you have. And what I think is a fantastic example, and this isn't AI, but you'll get it. So there's a film from the early 80s called The Thing. It's made by John Carpenter, who's a fantastically weird director. It's almost Halloween at the point when I'm recording this. So if you've never watched The Thing, you should watch The Thing if you don't mind kind of scary-ish films. I wouldn't call it a horror film. More of a thriller. But The Thing has Kurt Russell, like a very young Kurt Russell, and it is often considered the absolute peak of practical effects. So I actually just watched The Thing for the first time in like the past year or so, and I was freaking blown away by how good the special effects were. It looked better, and keep in mind, I think The Thing is 1982. I want to say it was made in 1982, so quite a long time ago now. But the effects in The Thing were honestly better than almost any modern CGI that I've seen. It just blew my mind. Like, how in the heck did someone figure out how to do this? And that's an art form that's becoming lost, like these sorts of practical effects. Although Beetlejuice 2 just came out, and I know they have the original style claymation in there because Michael Keaton demanded that, it be included. If he wants to be, or if they want him to be a part of the film, they have to keep it authentic to what made the original special. And I think that's such an awesome call out because these sorts of things, they just add something. There's something special about it. I don't think modern CGI has the same kind of flair as the practical effects in The Thing, or even the ships in Star Wars. That's a 1970s film, the original series. And in many cases, I think those practical effects look better, certainly, than the early 2000s Star Wars. It just feels more real. There's something amazing about that. And I think we as humans should continue to celebrate that kind of craft. Or another example would be watches, where if you have a new iWatch, eventually that thing will depreciate rapidly because it's just, electronic tech. You don't buy an iWatch as an investment or something that you will hand down generation to generation, where a handmade Rolex, you would. And those things do appreciate in value, and they are handmade. And I think that matters, and it's just a matter of what you value and what you're willing to pay for the human-made versus not. But ultimately, to sum this all up, what it means to be creative will adapt. Humans have adapted through technology changes through all time, and I believe they will continue to adapt and thrive as AI changes everything around us in ways that I don't think we can properly conceive right now. We're pretty bad at estimating what we can do in the short term versus the very long term, and I think the very long term is probably going to get pretty weird in ways that we don't fully understand. But if you are a creative, keep doing what makes you special and keep pushing, and don't neglect new technologies. I think it behooves you and anyone to learn these things, learn how to use them to your advantage so you don't fall behind. But that is it for this video. I appreciate you making it all the way through this. It has been a wild ride through AI-generated adventures and images and copyright infringement. And if you have questions or comments, drop them in the comments section. I just relaunched this channel, so honestly, I have a group of videos I want to make before I dig into the comments and read everything, just to do my thing without caring too much about what other people think. Whether that sounds good or bad, I don't know. But I don't want to get too stuck up on like, how many views does this have? What are people saying in the comments? But at some point in time, I will read through this and use what you say to hopefully make better stuff in the future. So if you take your time to do that, I do appreciate it. And of course, if you want to keep seeing new content like this in the future, please subscribe. I'm doing my best right now to do about 1 video a month, so we'll see how that goes. But once again, appreciate your support, and until the next one.